You're listening to Criticaleye's Inspiring Leaders podcast. Criticaleye is a global membership community with over 2 decades of experience supporting senior executives in their roles. We work with board-level executives, giving them opportunities to build their knowledge, skills, and access independent reference points outside of their immediate networks. Whether you're stepping up into a more senior role or aspiring to do so, looking to hone high-level stakeholder relationships, drive operational performance, build your own personal resilience as a leader, or have longer-term career goals such as moving into a plural career, Criticaleye's approach supports a range of leadership challenges and ambitions.
Hi there, and welcome to this episode of Criticaleye's Inspiring Leaders podcast. My name is Jacob Ambrose Willson. I'm a senior editor at Criticaleye. I'm your host for this conversation, where we'll be looking at how leaders should approach cyber risk in a world that is becoming increasingly polarized and complex. So I'm very fortunate to have a genuine expert in the cyber advisory space joining me today. It's Jon Rigby. Jon is currently a senior cyber advisor with AlixPartners, having previously established and co-led the cyber practice at AlixPartners some time ago. In between those spells at AlixPartners, Jon undertook a similar role in the insurance industry at Liberty Specialty Markets. And prior to that, he served for over 30 years in the RAF in various intelligence, cyber and engineering roles. So look, there's a huge deal of insight we can draw on from you, Jon. First of all, welcome to the pod. How are you doing today?
Good to be here. It's a lovely day in London.
Indeed, yes. All right. So look, there's been a fair few examples of large businesses being victims of cyber attacks lately. Do we tend to know who the cyber criminals behind these attacks are? And are there any trends or patterns in terms of where the big threats are coming from at the moment?
I think the way to think about it is less about who they are and what their motivation might be, because ultimately they're criminals. We'll come to state actors in a bit, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And what they're after, like all criminals, they've either got something against you, hacktivist is the common frame, or they've got something, you've got something that they want. That could be data, it could be position in market, it could be reputation, it could be money, it could be whatever. And I think the thing from a C-suite perspective is not necessarily to come from the perspective of who is after me, but to come from a perspective of what have I got that's valuable, mm-hmm. and how can I protect it, and how much should I spend on protecting it?
Yeah,
I think you asked about trends.
Yeah.
Again, I think we'll within the threat space we'll come back to this, but ransomware clearly is the clear trend at the moment. Maybe 10 years ago, it wasn't. It was something that when we started the advisory practice, it was there on the radar, but it wasn't something that we were particularly concerned about because the ransomware threats were small. Now they're huge. And I think there's a really interesting debate about ransomware from an individual company perspective, but also from an environmental perspective about when it maybe tips into a systemic or an aggregate risk. So I think looking at ransomware is interesting, but ultimately, if you're sitting on a business with assets and value, you've got to protect that. Same as a house, really.
Yeah. Obviously, the geopolitical situation at the moment is very topical and pressing in terms of what's going on out there. Has there been a discernible increase in state-sponsored sort of attacks on businesses in particular at the moment?
There doesn't appear to have been. I think sometimes you can never tell because those entities or those nations that use cyber as a weapon, they very often use criminal entities as their how can I describe it, as their team, mm-hmm. As the people who actually perpetrate the acts. So sometimes it can be hidden behind criminal activity, but surprisingly, there haven't been any systemic attacks on infrastructure or on any particular companies that I know of. I'm a bit surprised by that.
Mm-hmm.
There were some attacks in and around the start of the recent Ukraine war, but they kind of were suppressed, but they're kind of secondary. So the whole business has been keeping an eye out for systemic nationwide attacks on critical national infrastructure, and it's not happened. And it seems to be this thing sitting in the background that everyone's really worried about, that is shaping perception, shaping fears, but it's still not happened yet. Now, I would be a very brave man to say that it's never going to happen. I'm sure it is, but it's not become that huge thing that we always worried about. And I think when you're sitting on the inside planning an operation like this, I still think cyber is relatively immature. It is still a weapon that you would use to shape an environment rather than necessarily to achieve that golden bullet hit. You watch the movies and it's all about that golden bullet. They press a button and the whole infrastructure comes down and the war's won. I think that's a long way from the reality. I think cyber is used to shape an environment rather than actually as the golden bullet.
Okay, yeah. And if we put this in the context of boards and risk, would you agree that the cyber continues to be one of the highest risks in the eyes of boards, and how well equipped are they to address this risk?
Well, I mean, let's just go for the first one. I think all the evidence, particularly in the AlixPartners recent disruption index, points to the fact that the C-suite and boards, and I think we need to distinguish them, those two entities, are worried about cyber risk, and about maybe the unknowns around the cyber risk and the uncertainty around the cyber risk. They can probably put financial risk in its box. Even with the uncertainties around what's going on at the moment, you can still understand what the geopolitical risk might well be and might well do. And boards and executives are educated in that space. Not all are educated in the cyberspace. So yes, they do see it as an issue. And despite more and more now seeking to address it, it's still that uncertainty. I think in my experience, coming back into consultancy after maybe 5-6 years, the more regulated industries and the bigger businesses pretty much on it. It doesn't mean that they're not going to get hacked, as we've seen, but they're on it. They discuss it. It's on the agenda. They have a funded security program. They have a top end security officer. The smaller businesses can rely on standard products. Microsoft has got a very good security product if you configure it properly. And then you've got the middle scale industries. And I think that's probably where the focus needs to be, because very often they're in a supply chain to a major industry. Very often they're short of resources. Very often they're cash strapped. And they're in that situation where it's really quite tough to get the expertise and the mass in order to put a proper cyber defense together. So I would say it's that middle bit, which is where I would say the bigger concern happens to be. And actually, it's quite interesting. It'd be nice to come back to this later. The supply chain is so fundamental to the bigger entities that actually how much interest is an automotive main player looking at the security of its supply chain and supporting that supply chain to be secure, because of course there's a dependency there.
So that kind of trickles down from the larger organizations into the mid-tier.
Well, it does, and I think some of the recent breaches that we've seen have been on mid-tier and sometimes even small elements within the supply chains of the bigger entities, totally disrupting what's going on. Now, that clearly is happening at the moment in the Straits of Hormuz as well. It's happened in the not too distant past in the Suez Canal, but cyber can do this at scale, and so I think the smart thinking is around how you sort out your supply chain, and I think that plays very squarely into, I think we all, industry, whether you're consulting, whether you're actually owning a business, need to focus on those middle tier businesses.
Yeah, interesting. In terms of approaches now, where do you think, boards, C-suites can fall short? Maybe there's a temptation to view cyber as part of a box ticking exercise, or it's delegated to the individual in the team, in the C-suite team, that has responsibility. I know you mentioned a chief security officer, for example. I know some firms are using those individuals to maybe take care of it.
Right. So there's a lot in that. So let's just start with the Chief Information Security Officer, the Chief Security Officer, and the industry will debate forever as to what the title is, but the guy responsible for cyber security. The very wise man who helped me out when I first started consulting says that if the Chief Security Officer is more than two positions removed from the CEO, then don't invest in that business. So the security officer needs to report to someone who reports to the CEO at least.
Yeah.
Now that could be the CIO, it could be the CFO, it could be someone who has got real strength and gravitas around the board. So that's the first thing. I think, in my experience, it's still not quite organized in a way that the board C-suite relationship is in for other subjects, just because of that knowledge and shared understanding doesn't quite exist yet, as we discussed before. So the one thing I would recommend would be to make sure the C-suite and maybe 3 or 4 nominated NEDs have a dialogue outside the normal structure, just to get up to a shared understanding of what's going on. Because if it goes into the normal regulatory board responsibilities, there is a danger that both sides will clam up and not get to that shared understanding. So first of all, a shared understanding between the two entities that are running the organization. Then I think the board needs to get to ask tough questions of the executive after they've gone through that initial phase. And it's not unusual for the bigger businesses to have someone with security experience or high technical experience on the board. I think we discussed it in Criticaleye before, actually, the age demographic issues and the technology demographic issues that you're actually seeing on some of the boards. And so I think that's an important role of the chair to make sure that they've got that expertise sitting around the board table to ask the tough, appropriate questions. As far as C-suite is concerned, I think they need to make sure that there is sufficient investment in protection of their assets. I'll come back to what sufficient looks like in a minute, but just focus a bit on protection and a bit on detection of loss of data or ransomware or whatever. And that's going to cost some money, and you're going to have to trust the security officer to a degree as to what's being offered, but you also need to challenge the security officer. Then I think where the C-suite really does come in is if there has been an event, to actually come in to make sure that they personally manage that event. If you think about it, once an event has occurred, the clock is now ticking on your reputational damage. The clock is ticking if you don't close the door on the loss of your data. The clock is ticking on the loss of your share value. And so the C-suite coming in and owning and leading that, as they would any other major event, is super important. And actually, potentially, is a better investment in time and money than necessarily investing everything on the protection side. And that then means that you have to train. It means the first time, this is where my military background comes out, the first time you want to be thinking about this isn't when it's happened. You want to have some muscle memory before you have the event. And so that's super important to do that. Yeah. And then the final thing, probably more C-suite than board, but it encompasses both, is to come at this from a risk perspective.
Yep.
I did an advisory about 6 years ago where it was for private equity. The private equity said, well, that's great, John. We've got 3 phases of program and that's going to make us super secure. But I don't have enough money to do the 3rd phase, so I'm going to take that risk. And they had invested some time to understand where the risk was and where their cash was to make sure that the two balanced themselves out. And I think if you're coming at it from understanding the potential loss of revenue from an extended outage, the loss of reputational damage, fines and things like that, the board can and should get their head around what those losses are, because that's a business decision. And then there's a dialogue about what the equivalent cybersecurity protection is around that. Loads of mechanisms. Everyone will advise you to get you into that position, but that dialogue needs to be around risk, and that's a leadership inside the business that needs to get there to do that.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm going to come on to the muscle memory point you made just then. But first of all, just staying with the C-suite. Now, clearly, the CEO is very important in all of this. But what about the CFO and also the Chief People Officer when it comes to, conversations like pre-attack and then also, when you're in the midst of it?
I mean, just looking at those two particular, I mean, all the C-suite roles are important in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
But just looking at those two particular roles, I think the CFO is really, really important because he or she needs to understand what the risk is and what the costs are, and to make sure that the plan is appropriate, and the spend is appropriate. So I've got lots of CISO friends whose budgets are being cut.
Yeah,
it's crazy. The budgets need to be efficient, but really that's a choice of where the investment lies rather than reducing the budget. So the CFO needs to understand it sufficiently to make the right call and the right advice. CFO typically will be involved in cyber insurance or insurance. So again, that's where the CFO needs to be engaged in that whole evolution. And I think the CFO tends to be, I mean, CRO is, the risk officer is in there as well. But the CFO probably will have that insight as to what the business can afford to lose in terms of revenue and capital and reputation. That's really important. Really important. When I've done C-suite meetings and briefings and training, CFO doesn't tend to say a lot, but when they do, everyone listens. So they're really important. Chief People Officer, I think, is probably second or third most important person around the board, because most of the events will be related to an individual. Most of the events, probably 50%, will be related to an employee. So whether that is a disgruntled employee, very unlikely, but it happens. Whether it's someone who decides to take IP that he's generated within the firm to his next business and sends it to himself, unlikely, but it happens, but can be controlled. Whether it's someone who is not really entitled to see particular parts of data or sensitive client information, but the controls aren't in place, and so they can see it even though they're not meant to. Or whether it's someone just being dumb and clicking on a malware link. And
phishing,
we've all done it, haven't we?
Yeah.
It's so easy, but if there's been no training, then actually there's culpability there. If there's been training, then it shouldn't say this, but it's part of a business's existence. So if you say that, if you think that 50% of events have got a person involved, if your people policies and your access policies and your people security policies are not aligned, then you're not doing all you need to do in order to actually get those quick and easy wins sorted out. And sometimes it's tough because there is always a trade-off. There's a trade-off between employee empowerment. There's a trade-off between employee personal data. Sometimes employees feel that they're being, not being trusted, and that's got an impact upon morale. So that's really important to have that conversation with the head of HR. And I wouldn't wish to exclude from this the Chief Information Officer, who's very often the line manager for the security officer. Yes, they are the representative and on C-suite of the security officer, but actually, if they're not resolving technical debt or not sorting out patching policy in a proportionate manner, then they're actually adding to the problem. And I'm not saying for a moment that technical debt should be removed automatically at the expense of revenue, because that's a naive thing to say. But that conversation must be had, coming back to the risk point, so the risk is balanced between business continuing to make profit or business actually losing profitability because it has a cyber event. So those are the three people that I think are really important, other than the CEO, to make sure that you got involved. But I've done engagements where actually you have the warp and weft, you have the corporate functions, but then you also have the regional leadership who need to be involved in this, because very often there are regional nuances to security as well, whether it be compliance, governance, threat environment. So when I do these, I look at all of them, but I absolutely start with the CFO, the CEO, CFO, CIO, and the Chief People Officer.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Look, how important is it to rehearse an attack and run through different scenarios? Because there are many different entry points, I suppose.
Yeah. I think it's fundamental. I mean, going back to my insurance time, insurers are seeking to offer services in addition to the basic insurance product, and a lot of those around incident response. And they're not just doing it to be nice, they're doing it because if they reduce the incident response time, then the cost to the business is less, the cost to the insurers is less. So it's absolutely fundamental. It's almost certain that what you rehearse will not equal what happens on a bad day in the office, but that rehearsal produces some muscle memory. It gets the CEO thinking along the right lines, asking the right sort of questions. He starts to know who to ask. It puts the security officer under appropriate pressure. So any good security officer will go away and think, "Oh dear, I didn't get that one right. Let me go and make sure I do better next time," and they will continue to re-examine themselves. It gets the chief counsel very often involved in the debate, and the chief counsel and the insurers discussing where the liability lands and these sorts of things. So all of these tendrils, which you would not normally need to exercise on a normal business day around security, get energized, and people know where they are. And even if you just think of a simple model where you're losing 100 grand every day, let's say, just for sake of argument, if your incident clips it on day 2, you've lost 200 grand. If it goes on for a week, you've lost 700 grand. It's quite simple. The faster you clip that is the faster that you reduce your losses. And then you go beyond the losses, and I think it heads into the reputational damage sphere. And I think a lot of the CEOs I've spoken to, particularly the bigger organizations, that's what they worry about most. That they worry about the reputational damage to their brand, both their personal brand, but also to the brand of their business. And it's possible to have a good outcome from a bad event. So if we all remember back to the Marks and Spencer's incident response, it was really damaging for them. It's really tough. But because they handled it so well, because they communicated properly, because it was obvious to their clients, their customers, that they were doing their best, they emerged with the brand pretty much clean. And so I think good incident response is maybe the only way, other than avoiding an event, that you're going to preserve your brand value. It's fundamental, absolutely fundamental.
Yeah. Okay. So time is of the essence. Is that maybe the mistake you see happen, regularly? People not reacting fast enough, or is it, other mistakes that you see? What are you seeing essentially?
I'm not sure I see a trend. I don't think I could see. It's probably worthwhile researching it actually to look at a sector by sector, scale by scale basis in terms of performance around incident response.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's getting better, and I think the insurance industry has driven that.
Yeah.
So I think it's getting better. I think intuitively it is people thinking that cyber is too technical and it's a domain of the techies. I think that goes across the whole waterfront, not taking ownership of what is a fundamental business risk. And I need to show my annoyance here. It's 10 years since I went into the commercial space, and it wasn't viewed as a risk then. This is something that the C-suite really should have got to grips with by now. Now, that could be that my industry isn't giving them adequate advice, but it's something that the C-suite should get to grips with right now. And I think if I to give them two pieces of advice, think about your cyber risk from a risk basis. Talk to your security people and make yourself comfortable that they're spending the right money on the right stuff for protect and defend, and then get your incident response right. Because when it goes wrong, you can't say it's the security officer's fault. You can't say it's the supply chain's fault. It's on you.
Yeah, and get your hands round this before the next generation of quantum computing powered cyber.
Yeah, I think the understanding of where that's going to land is yet to land. But yes, it's not getting easier.
No. Well, maybe that's a topic for another day. Jon, we've covered a fair bit of ground, so thank you very much. I'll look to wrap it up today. I hope you enjoyed recording with us, and yeah, do to the listeners out there, please do come back to all your main podcast outlets where you can find the Criticaleye Inspiring Leaders podcast. But that's all for today. Thanks again, Jon, and see you later.
Thanks, Jacob.